The morning sun crept slowly across the barracks, casting long, pale lines over the frozen ground. The German POWs stirred reluctantly, their movements sluggish from months of confinement and hunger. And yet, there was a strange tension in the air, a whisper of anticipation that none dared speak aloud. Carl moved among them, his eyes scanning faces gaunt and pale. Yet alive with curiosity, he had heard rumors of the Americans serving something extraordinary this morning, something that would challenge every expectation the men carried with them from the war and from the stories that had traveled silently between camps. The guards called them to the mess hall, a building they had rarely entered except for meals that were thin, tasteless. And predictable, the POWs shuffled forward their boots, crunching over frost-hardened mud and gravel, every step echoing in the cold morning air as they approached the door. A smell drifted out, a smell warm and inviting, unlike anything they had encountered. In months or years it was rich and buttery and carried a sweetness that made their stomachs clench with both hunger and disbelief. The men glanced at one another, eyebrows raised and lips twitching with confusion and something that bordered on anticipation. Inside the mess hall, the scene was unlike anything they could have imagined. Tables were laid neatly with steaming trays of eggs, bacon sausages, pancakes, fruit, and bread. The aroma filled the room so completely that for a moment, silence fell over the men as if the very air were holding its breath. Even the guards paused, their usual rough demeanor softened slightly by the effort and care put into the meal. Carl stepped forward hesitantly, his eyes wide, scanning the trays moving. From one item to another, the colors, the smells, the warmth of the food. It was overwhelming, and yet there was a strange order to it, as if this chaos of abundance were controlled and deliberate, every item in its place, every scent intended to provoke wonder and perhaps disbelief. The POWs gathered along the tables, their hands trembling slightly as they reached out to touch the trays. Many hesitated, unsure if this was a trick, some illusion or a test. The men who had survived artillery fire, sniper, bullets, and frost-bitten nights in the field now found themselves challenged by something far more disarming. A breakfast that seemed impossibly large, impossibly well prepared, and impossibly generous. Their stomachs roared with hunger, but their minds raced with questions about why this was happening, why they were being shown this, and what it meant in a world where every day had been a lesson in survival and scarcity. Dieter picked up a plate, a simple gesture, yet his hands shook as he moved it along the table, choosing a few items, yet not daring to take too much. The men around him mirrored his caution, each bite hesitant as if savoring it might break the spell. The eggs were fluffy and warm, the bacon crisped to perfection, and the pancakes sweet and soft, with a richness they had long thought impossible in a prison camp. Each chew a shock to the senses, a reminder of life outside the fences, and of abundance they had never known. Carl whispered to the man beside him, noting the contrast to the meager rations they had endured, and the look in his eyes was a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The guards watched silently, some with mild amusement, others with a faint hint of pride for the effort they had made for the prisoners. A small act that carried enormous weight in the minds of the POWs. The room seemed to expand and contract with the murmurs of men tasting warmth, tasting richness, tasting care for the first time in months, perhaps years, their senses heightened, their minds alert to the novelty of the experience and the uncertainty of its purpose. The breakfast became more than food. It became a puzzle, a question and a challenge wrapped in butter and syrup. Outside the windows, frost sparkled on the panes, glinting. In the morning sun, the POWs glanced out briefly, noticing the world unchanged, yet different somehow. The men carried their plates carefully, their movements tentative as though the food itself were fragile, their minds racing with theories. Some whispered about propaganda, others about a test of character. But beneath it all was a quiet awe that the Americans had provided such care and abundance, and that the men who had been trained to suspect everything now faced a simple act of generosity that could not be explained easily or dismissed. One of the younger POWs hesitated by the coffee urn, his hands hovering over the handle. He had never seen such a thing, a steaming dark liquid that smelled bitter yet invigorating. He poured a small cup, careful not to spill, and sipped slowly, closing his eyes as warmth spread through his chest and a strange clarity came over him. The men around him noticed, and some smiled faintly. Others frowned, unsure how to process the unfamiliar sensation of comfort in a world that had demanded suspicion and fear for so long. Every sip became a ritual, a moment to reflect, and every glance at the trays and the guards heightened the tension because they could not yet be sure if this was truly generosity or a precursor to something else. The senior officers among the POWs gathered their men and spoke quietly, their words low and careful. The breakfast was discussed not just as sustenance, but as a symbol. The questions were endless. What did it mean? Why now? Why such care and attention? What did the Americans hope to achieve by feeding them so well, so completely? It was a mystery that stirred both admiration and unease. Every officer understood that the men were being tested in ways they could not yet articulate, that the ordinary act of eating had become extraordinary, and that this meal would be remembered long after the plates were cleared. Carl moved to the side of the room, helping a few men who struggled with utensils unused to abundance, their hands awkward as they tried to balance plates overflowing with food, their eyes wide and their hearts uncertain. He spoke softly, encouraging them to take more, not less, to experience the food fully, to understand that for once, scarcity and fear were not the guides of their actions. The men looked at him with hesitation, and some nodded slowly, as if discovering a new law of behavior that required trust and patience, and that the breakfast was more than nourishment. It was instruction, in something that transcended hunger. A sudden noise at the door startled several of the POWs. A group of guards had entered with trays of pastries and bread. The smell of fresh-baked goods rolled through the room, causing several men to stumble slightly, and then regain their balance. The abundance was almost laughable, a ridiculous extravagance after months of thin soup and hard biscuits. The men exchanged glances, some incredulous, some bewildered, their minds trying to reconcile the reality of food, so plentiful and perfect with the memories of deprivation and the silent understanding that this was no ordinary day and that the breakfast might carry a meaning deeper than they could yet comprehend. Outside the mess hall, the wind rose suddenly. Blowing through the trees and across the yard, a flurry of snow danced in the light, as if to remind the men of the harsh world beyond the windows. Yet inside, the warmth of the hall and the richness of the food created a bubble of disbelief and wonder. The men ate slowly, careful to savor every bite, yet acutely aware that nothing in the world was truly free, and that even the simplest act of care might contain a lesson, a warning, or a test. Every chew a step into uncertainty, every swallow a challenge to their ingrained suspicions, and every glance at the American cooks a question about intent. The young men who had never known hunger except in the uniformed strictness of rationed days now looked at their plates with reverence and fear, their hands shaking slightly as they reached for more food. Some whispered under their breath about how this might change everything, how a simple meal could alter perception and perhaps even allegiance, how the ordinary act of feeding prisoners could become a weapon more potent than bullets or artillery. Every morsel swallowed carried weight. Every taste of butter and syrup was a reminder of life beyond survival and a challenge to the mental walls they had built over years of captivity. And, as the sun climbed higher, the POWs continued their meal. The room filled with murmurs of surprised delight and cautious conversation. Every bite a mixture of pleasure and suspicion, every glance a silent calculation of what this meant for them. And, for the future, the breakfast had become more than a meal. It had become a quiet battlefield, a test of trust and observation. a place where the ordinary had been transformed into the extraordinary, and where every man understood that the simplest gestures could carry the heaviest consequences, and that this morning would linger in memory long after hunger was forgotten. The aroma of the breakfast lingered in the barracks long after the trays were cleared and the men returned to their bunks, yet the effect on the POWs was far from over whispers and glances, carried the memory of eggs, bacon, and syrup, as if each flavor were a secret code, unlocking thoughts that had been dormant since the early months of captivity. Carl moved quietly among the men, noting the subtle changes, the way hands lingered over utensils, the way eyes tracked one another for reaction. Every man wrestling with an unfamiliar sensation of abundance mixed with uncertainty. Some dared to smile. Others kept their expressions rigid, as if showing pleasure might be dangerous in a world that had trained them to expect deprivation and distrust. Dieter and Hans gathered a small group in a corner of the barracks, discussing what they had seen and felt. Some of the men were reluctant to speak, their voices low and cautious, yet curiosity pushed them forward. They compared plates, the order in which food had been served, the attention of the cooks, the careful placement of hot coffee cups, and even the texture of bread and pastries. Every detail catalogued and memorized, as if these observations might one day be crucial to understanding the intentions behind the generosity. The men speculated silently about the purpose behind such care, whether it was a form of psychological manipulation, a display of power, or a subtle lesson in civility and discipline. Outside the barracks, the frost had begun to melt under the morning sun, yet the world remained harsh and unforgiving. The POWs moved slowly between tasks, some carrying water, others hauling firewood, yet each step was colored by the lingering taste of breakfast, their stomachs fuller than they had been in months, and their minds swirling with thoughts they had long suppressed. The ordinary duties of camp life now seemed lighter somehow, each man carrying with him the secret knowledge that life could exist beyond hunger, and fear that moments of comfort could arrive even in captivity, and that trust might be possible in unexpected forms. During work detail, the men exchanged careful glances while carrying supplies for the guards. Some whispered quietly under their breath about the previous morning, comparing observations of the breakfast. Some speculated about how far the generosity might extend, whether it would continue to lunch or dinner, or if this was a singular moment designed to disorient and confuse them. Carl listened and nodded occasionally, offering insight into the patterns of behavior he had observed in the Americans, suggesting that the attention to detail was deliberate, yet layered with an unexpected kindness, a concept difficult for men trained to expect cruelty and scarcity. In the evenings, the barracks filled with low murmurs. As the men gathered near stoves, the warmth spreading slowly through frost-chilled bones. The breakfast had become a topic of discussion that carried weight and gravity. They spoke quietly, not daring to draw attention from the guards, yet the excitement in their eyes betrayed their fascination with the event. Dieter traced sequences in his mind, noting the reactions of each man, cataloging what had sparked curiosity or delight and what had caused hesitation or suspicion. He understood that this breakfast was now more than food. It was a test, a lesson, and a story that would ripple quietly through the camp over the following days and weeks. Letters, written to families in far-off villages, became a careful exercise in subtle revelation for the POWs, each sentence crafted to convey survival, yet hinting at the abundance and care they had experienced without drawing attention to themselves. The memory of pancake syrup and rich coffee became a private language, a code of hope that could be shared in hushed tones without ever being explicitly stated. Hans carefully guided the younger men on how to describe sustenance without raising suspicion, teaching them to embed gratitude in description without revealing the extent of their experiences in a world where even small gestures of care could be misunderstood. One morning, a new group of prisoners arrived. The men watched curiously as the Americans greeted them with the same attention to food and comfort that had startled them. The newcomers were pale and wary, unfamiliar with the routines and the subtle signals that the breakfast had now become a part of Carl and Dieter's unspoken network. They guided the new arrivals through the rituals, teaching them to approach trays calmly, to take only what was necessary, and to savor the experience without letting fear dictate every action. The scene became a delicate balance of instruction and observation, each act monitored yet unobtrusive. The senior guards observed these interactions, silently noting the changes in the prisoners, the way they moved their hands, the glances they exchanged, the careful way they approached food and conversation. They whispered among themselves, wondering if the breakfast had altered the dynamics of obedience and morale, if a simple act of care could shift the balance of authority in subtle but profound ways. The POWs remained largely unaware of the scrutiny. Yet the tension was palpable, each smile or nod a silent gamble between trust and caution. As days passed, the POWs began to experiment cautiously, with sharing small portions of the food among themselves, a piece of bread here, a slice of fruit there. Each act an extension of what they had experienced during the breakfast, an attempt to carry the generosity further within the camp walls. They whispered quietly, teaching each other the rules of trust and sharing, observing reactions and cataloging, who might be reliable in extending the lessons beyond the barracks. The simple act of eating had now become a social experiment, a measure of human response under controlled abundance and observation. Carl and Dieter noticed subtle changes in the men's behavior during work. Details: some moved with less tension, their shoulders lighter, their backs straighter. Some engaged more readily in conversation when given tasks, yet maintained caution in eye contact and speech. The influence of the breakfast extended beyond sustenance. It had affected morale and camaraderie, and perhaps even challenged the deep-seated notions of authority and hierarchy that had dominated the POWs since capture. Each step outside the barracks became a continuation of the lessons learned over coffee, eggs, and syrup. One afternoon, a small accident occurred in the kitchen. A pot tipped over, spilling food and creating chaos. The POWs watched in suspense, unsure how the guards would react, yet, to their astonishment, the guards and cooks responded with patience and calm, instructing them gently to help clean up without scolding or punishment. The POWs realized the lesson of the breakfast extended beyond the meal itself. It was a demonstration of ordered discipline, and humanity a lesson in how care could coexist with authority, and that observation and subtle action were now as important as survival skills learned in the field. Or on the March evening, gatherings grew more organized as the POWs created routines. For discussing the events of the morning, the breakfast became a reference point for stories and lessons, whispered quietly, each man memorizing reactions and behaviors, noting subtle shifts in the guards' demeanor and in the response of fellow prisoners. They mapped the psychology of generosity and caution, analyzing how trust could be extended without endangering themselves, and how knowledge could be preserved through observation and memory. The ordinary act of eating had become a crucible for understanding human behavior in captivity. Rumors began circulating about future breakfasts and the possibilities of greater abundance. Each man speculated quietly on what might be provided next, whether they would see fresh meat, vegetables, or even dishes previously unheard of in the harsh routines of prison life. The anticipation created a strange energy among the POWs, a blend of hope, curiosity, and careful strategy. Every step in approaching the mess hall became calculated, every glance at. The guards weighed for signs of change or intention. The breakfast had shifted the mental landscape as much as the physical one, and every man understood that the ordinary had been transformed into the extraordinary. Carl and Dieter worked late into the night, mapping reactions and responses, the movements of men and guards, every glance, gesture, and whispered comment cataloged and analyzed. The lesson of the breakfast extended beyond nourishment. It was a lesson in observation, control, and human psychology, a model for interaction and subtle influence that might shape the behavior of men far beyond the barracks and even beyond the camp. If properly understood and applied, the morning meal had become a laboratory for understanding the delicate interplay of generosity, authority, and survival. As the moon rose, the barracks quieted. The men lay in their bunks reflecting on the day, their stomachs full, but their minds restless. The memory of the breakfast replayed in every detail, every smell, and taste a continuous reminder of both possibility and caution, and every glance exchanged with a neighbor carried silent acknowledgement that the event had changed something fundamental. The ordinary act of eating had become a profound lesson and a quiet battlefield, where trust, suspicion, curiosity, and wonder were tested silently and continuously. And as the night deepened, the shadows of the barracks seemed to hold the echoes of clinking plates and murmured words. The POWs slept lightly, each man alert to subtle movements and sounds, carrying with them the knowledge that the breakfast was only the beginning, that the lessons it taught would unfold slowly, and that the smallest gestures of generosity could ripple through lives in ways that were profound and unforeseen. The days stretched onward, and the memory of the extraordinary breakfast refused to fade. The POWs carried it in every gesture, every glance, and every thought, each man replaying in his mind the texture of eggs, the crispness of bacon, the sweetness of syrup, and the warmth of coffee. It was as if the meal had planted a seed of wonder in their hearts, a seed that grew quietly in the frost-bitten barracks and in the snow-hardened yards outside the gates. Carl moved among them, observing the subtle changes, the way men stood taller, the cautious smiles exchanged across work details, the quiet nods acknowledging shared understanding, and an unspoken bond that had emerged from something as simple yet impossible as a morning meal. The guards watched, the transformations silently, their expressions masked, but their eyes attentive, noting the softening of posture, the lessening of muttered complaints, and the subtle increase in cooperative behavior. Even the senior officers began to take note, wondering how the ordinary act of feeding prisoners could produce results that no punishment drill or strict rationing had ever accomplished. The POWs themselves were aware only partially of the effect of the breakfast on morale and discipline, each man cautious to enjoy, yet suspicious of intent, and constantly questioning whether this was an isolated act or the first step in a more intricate plan of influence and observation. Word of the breakfast and its effects began to spread quietly through the camp, a whisper here, a glance there, a careful mention of coffee or fresh fruit. The news traveled among the men, creating anticipation and tension. Every conversation measured and hushed as each man attempted to reconcile his memories with the world outside the barracks and the expectations they had carried from months of deprivation, suspicion, and distrust. There was excitement, yet restraint, curiosity, yet fear, and a sense that the ordinary could now conceal extraordinary consequences. Carl and Dieter organized small study groups among the POWs, gathering the men after work details in corners of the barracks to discuss observations, to catalog behaviors, and to anticipate future events. Each group became a laboratory of human psychology, noting the smallest changes in demeanor, each word chosen with care, and each reaction analyzed meticulously for hidden signals, every interaction a puzzle piece, building a picture of the subtle effects of generosity, discipline, and controlled abundance, and how these forces could shape not only behavior but trust, suspicion, and loyalty. One morning, the Americans introduced a new variation in the breakfast trays, a selection of cheeses, fresh baked rolls, and small jars of preserves. The POWs approached cautiously, eyes wide, hands tentative, aware that the ordinary act of choosing food had become a test of observation, of restraint, and of understanding of subtle signals from the guards and cooks. Carl observed reactions closely, noting hesitation and curiosity, delight and fear. The men moved slowly, each bite weighed with thought, each glance at neighbors calculated carefully, as if learning rules of engagement for an invisible battlefield of civility and restraint. Outside the barracks, the world remained harsh, cold, and unyielding. Yet inside, the warmth of the mess hall and the richness of the food created a psychological sanctuary, a place where observation and learning were paramount, and where the ordinary had been transformed into extraordinary lessons in human behavior. The men carried these experiences with them into work details in the yard, hauling wood and water, observing glances, listening for cues, cataloging every smile, frown, or gesture as if the lessons of the breakfast extended far beyond food and into strategy. Survival and the subtleties of trust rumors began to emerge of special privileges for those who displayed understanding and restraint. The POWs were careful to observe each other, noting who shared portions, who hesitated, and who acted impulsively, every action recorded in memory, a silent ledger of trust and reliability. The lesson of the breakfast now extended into the social structure of the camp, a subtle hierarchy of understanding emerging where knowledge of the ordinary, extraordinary act of food became a marker for perception and caution. Carl and Dieter grew increasingly aware that the influence of the breakfast was reaching deeper into minds and relationships. The younger men looked to them for guidance, cautious yet curious learning. Not only the rules of survival, but the rules of observation, the rules of subtle trust, and the unexpected power of ordinary generosity applied with discipline every movement of the American Guards. And cooks cataloged for intent and meaning, and every variation in food and presentation carefully noted for pattern and insight. One afternoon, a sudden storm forced the POWs and guards to take shelter in the mess hall early. The storm outside howled, and the wind rattled the windows, carrying snow and ice into every crevice. The warmth and abundance of the hall contrasted sharply with the violent world outside, each man acutely aware of the fragility of comfort and the potency of observation. The storm created a crucible for testing patience and behavior. Every glance across a table, every choice of food, and every gesture of care became magnified in importance. A test of awareness and control intensified by the roaring wind and the threat of nature beyond the walls. During this storm, the Americans introduced an entirely new element to the meal, a small serving of chocolate and candied fruit, each piece carefully placed and distributed, creating excitement yet hesitation among the POWs. The ordinary act of eating had now become a multi-layered exercise in trust, discernment, and observation, every man aware that each choice carried consequences for social standing and reputation within the camp hierarchy. Subtle alliances formed over shared portions and whispered approvals, while unspoken judgments were passed silently across the tables. The breakfast was no longer just nourishment. It had evolved into an instrument shaping thought, behavior, and relationships. Carl noticed subtle conflicts arising, a younger man attempting to take more than his fair share, prompting quiet intervention from peers and careful monitoring from guards. The lesson was clear that the ordinary act of receiving generosity could test character, and the responses to it could define relationships, trustworthiness, and the social order within the confined space of the barracks. Each act a delicate balance between self-interest and collective understanding, and each reaction a demonstration of comprehension of the unspoken rules embedded in the morning meal. The storm raged on, yet inside the warmth persisted and the lessons deepened. The POWs began to discuss silently the psychological dimensions of the breakfast, comparing notes, observations, and insights, every man seeking to understand the intent behind generosity and discipline. The ordinary had been transformed into a complex system of interaction with layers of meaning that could influence morale, obedience, and social cohesion. The breakfasts had become a silent battlefield of observation, subtlety, and interpretation, where even the smallest gesture carried weight and consequence. Night fell, and the barracks settled into quiet anticipation. The POWs lay in their bunks, their thoughts occupied by the lessons of the day. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence of their minds, yet within them was a sense of awe and cautious optimism. Every taste of food, every glance observed, every whispered comment had altered perception and reshaped expectation. The simple act of eating had become a profound teacher of human nature. Trust, caution, and the subtle power of generosity applied with intention as the storm abated. The morning arrived bright and clear. The POWs returned. To the mess hall, their movements careful and deliberate, every man aware that the ordinary act of food continued to shape behavior and relationships. The trays were laid with precision and care, and the men approached them with a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and cautious strategy. Every bite, a reaffirmation of lessons learned, every glance across the table, an assessment of allies and observers, and every gesture from the Americans, a test of comprehension and restraint. By midday, Carl and Dieter realized that the breakfast had fundamentally altered the social dynamics within the camp. The men were more alert, attentive, and engaged, yet cautious, each act of generosity from the Americans producing observable changes in behavior that extended into work detail conversations and interactions among the POWs. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and the lessons embedded in eggs, bacon, coffee, and pastries had rippled through the camp, altering understanding and expectation in ways that could not be easily undone or ignored. As the sun set, the barracks were alive with quiet conversation and careful analysis. The breakfast had become legend, a daily reminder that ordinary acts could carry extraordinary consequences. That observation and discernment were as important as survival, and that trust could be measured and extended carefully without fear of immediate reprisal. Every man lay awake, reflecting on meals, past meals, future, and the subtle lessons that had reshaped the world. Inside the barbed wire and stone walls of the camp, a world in which a breakfast had changed minds, hearts, and perceptions in ways far greater than any ration or punishment ever could. And as the moon rose over the camp, the POWs slept lightly each, man dreaming not of freedom or escape, but of eggs, crisp bacon, warm bread, and the power of generosity disguised as a meal, a quiet revolution in perception that would echo far beyond the barracks, beyond the guards and cooks, and into the hearts and minds of men who had long forgotten that ordinary acts could contain the extraordinary.